As it says on the front of our bulletin today, we all have one. It's a simple piece of furniture and one that has the power to define us. The table. The table is a subject that's discussed by church leaders, and I've listened to various talks. And what I share with you today is material that I have read and listened to lately, and I found it interesting, and I hope you do too. First, let's think for a moment about a particular group called the Amish. Amish people are known for their the Christian faith, strict, and yet they keep 90% of their kids. And how do they do that? Well, when Amish children turn 16, they are encouraged to experiment and explore, and the idea or the hope is that teens will come back to their church, come back to their home, come back to their faith after tasting the modern world. And for most, this means a tentative break, like a trip to the local movie theater or taking driving lessons. But for some, the experience called rumspringa, which literally means running around, is all about parties and fast cars and more. And rumspringa comes when kids reach a certain age and they say they're not sure they want to stay Amish, and parents say, okay, go on out there and find out if you want to or not. Breaking Amish has been a television show that speaks to this practice. Some of you may have seen the show. And as I said, kids are given a chance to see what they want to do. And as I said, 90% of the Amish, 90% stay Amish. But again, the question is how? How do they keep their kids? Well, every Amish home has 3 books, one being the Bible, that which keeps record of their story as people of the Christian faith. Secondly, they have a history book called Martyr's Mirror, which is the story of their ancestors, the story of those who suffered and died for the testimony of Jesus. Thirdly, they have the hymn book, this being a book that adds music to what has been said in book number 1 and book number 2. And so they have Bible stories, they have history stories, and they have the soundtrack that goes with it. And each book holds a significant and prominent place in Amish homes. And every day, sometimes twice a day, with the traditional Amish family, they will gather around a table and they will read and tell their stories and sing their story too. And by the way, when the child is on rumspringa and gone from that table, the family still sets a place for that child. There is a table setting, plates and silverware at their seat. Some families actually put food on that plate, prophesying the return of their child to that table. So, whenever someone is breaking Amish and doing that rumspringa thing, every one of them knows that back home there is a table, and at that table there is a place being saved for them, a table setting, maybe food on their plate, as the family waits for their return. Now, let's look at another group. World's growing, population is large. Jewish population, on the other hand, is small in comparison to others. There are a lot less Jewish people than there should be, because in the past people were not kind to the Jews. They tried to kill as many as they could, known as the Holocaust. The percentage of Jewish people is small. And yet, when Nobel Peace Prizes are given out, whether it's for chemistry, math, physics, biology, so on, what percentage of those goes to the Jews? I've read 40%. When the Oscars are given out, what percentage goes to them? 50 to 60%. When Pulitzer Prizes are given out, when any record of human achievement is made, this statistically insignificant part of the world's population is responsible for the bulk of human progress in industry, education, and more. So what's going on? What's going on here that this statistically insignificant part of the world's population is responsible for most of human progress? How does it happen? Well, they've studied this. And as many as those who have studied it, they have all come back to the same answer. The answer seems to be that the highest and the holiest moment in the Jewish religion takes place not in the synagogue, but in the home at the table. A table that is presided over not by the priest or the rabbi, but presided over by the elder. And here's a picture of a Seder meal, and you will see that children are present at the table. Room is made at the table for everyone. And I know this to be true because while attending seminary, I lived with a Jewish family in Toronto. And every Friday night, which marks the beginning of their Sabbath, the family, children included, gathered around the table in the dining room, and I too was welcomed and given a place at that table. On the Sabbath, candles are lit, prayers of blessing are offered, and around the table stories are told. And they say that the religious requirement of Judaism is that you have not properly participated in the ceremony around that table until you have received the story and seen yourself in that story. So when they hear the story of Moses standing up to Pharaoh, it's not Moses saying, "Let my people go," it's you. And so they're making the Jewish story their story. A Jewish child from day one is expected to question their story. In other words, the Jewish faith is hospitable to questions. And they will say to their children, "Do you have any doubts? Do you have any questions about your story? If so, let's talk about it. And let's bring it to the table." And the idea is that the story is strong enough to stand up to anything that you should bring to it. So from day one, for children, the table is a place filled with conversation, dialogue, discussion about their story, about their identity, who they are. And in these special moments, it's not only the words that tell the story for the Jewish population, it's the food as well. And at a Seder, what also drives and makes the story is, as I say, it is the food. The taste of the food is good. They serve excellent food, fabulous meals. But they say the taste of the food is important because the psalmist said, "Taste it and see that the Lord is good." When Jewish boys and girls turn 13, a coming-of-age ceremony in the Jewish religion takes place called a bar or bat mitzvah. And it marks the child's emergence into the adult world of Judaism. And it's not about having a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah. It's about becoming one. Becoming one to be a full-fledged member of the Jewish community, able to participate in all aspects of religious expression and existence. They are a son and daughter of the Holy One. And when this is what happens, when they say, what the child says at the bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah, "I am going to make this story my story," then they will spend the next few years being creative, imaginative, experimenting with this, trying to figure out this, because they have an identity that's based on a story that they have made their own. When our kids are teenagers, we don't have a bar or bat mitzvah parties where we say, "You are sons and daughters of the Messiah." We do have children baptized at an early age, however. And we do promise to do what we can to encourage them to grow up as a child of God. And when they come forward to be confirmed, it is our hope that they come forward with sincere, heartfelt belief in who they are and who they are entering into a relationship with. But when they reach young adult years, do we have a party to celebrate their identity? Do we affirm who they are in the eyes of God? Or do we say sometimes it's time to go out into the world, time to go find yourself and find out who you are? Do we say that to our children? And then do they say, okay, but who am I? And then they have to find their identity from scratch because they don't really know who they are? Do you know how much energy and imagination it takes to build one's identity from scratch? And let me tell you, this culture, the world out there, is very happy to help shape people's identity. Thousands of commercials every day will try to pull people in a direction that they want them to go in. The celebrity culture and the world will do the same. In other words, there are those out there who will say to our young children, build your life on my story, make it your own. Identity requires and needs a story. One's identity can't be built on values and views alone. Sometimes we've tried to build our Christian identity on verses because the Bible is written in verses. We've tried to build identity on principles. But remember, identity comes from being part of a story. And the story that's ours as Christians is the greatest story ever told. Please let's not ever say the greatest story never told. Do we know our story? Do we own our story? Do we sit at our table and tell it and celebrate it regularly? When we read the Bible, the Gospels in particular, Jesus is often at the table. Jesus comes out, first miracle takes place. He's at a wedding feast, a time when many people gather around a table. At that event, he turned water into wine. Sees Zacchaeus up in the tree, says, I'm coming to your house today. They go back and sit in the table and eat. Gathers his disciples together. They share a meal with each other. Today, I just ask, do we not live in a culture that is hungry for the table? Do we not live in a culture that needs to bring back the table? Popular TV show, Duck Dynasty. Every Duck Dynasty ends where? At the table, where all the kids are present, and they have a prayer. Blue Bloods, television show we like watching at home. It's about the Reagan family. They're Catholics. Have Sunday dinner together. Every Sunday night, they all sit at the table, tell their story, talk about what's going on, and they have a prayer. One person talks about his daughter who brought a friend home, and she visited and stayed with them for about 10 days. And at the end of her stay, the dad said to her, we really enjoyed your presence. You're a great person, but sometimes you seemed a little uncomfortable while you were here. Was everything okay? He asked. And she admitted she had felt uncomfortable, and he said, but how come? What did we do to cause that? And she said, well, she had never eaten before with a family at the table. Her family had always eaten in front of the TV. She had never eaten at the table at home. Now, here's an interesting finding. Columbia University did a study. They did a second study to validate the findings because they didn't believe it the first time. The greatest predictor of academic success in high school and college among elementary school kids was how many times they ate around the table. And the minimum that starts skyrocketing one's academic performance is 3 times a week. That's all it takes. Steve Jobs, genius in our time, inventor, designer, entrepreneur, co-founder, chief executive, and chairman of Apple Computer, strictly regulated the devices he allowed in his home, how often they were used, and they were never allowed any device at the table. He had a long table. At night, he gathered his entire family around that table. Nightly meals were what the kids looked forward to. And so there were conversations about history and education instead of the sounds of gunfire, of video games and such. But they told stories of their day, and they talked about what's going on in the world, and it was sacred time. Sacred table. And there were no devices on his table. Magic Johnson and Larry Bird, 2 professional basketball players, both very competitive, both very good. And they didn't like each other because they knew one could beat the other. But how did these arch rivals become friends? In 1985, Converse asked Johnson and Bird to tape a commercial in Bird's hometown. Johnson agreed to it, but he was nervous because he had never had a conversation with Bird. During the shoot, the two did not talk, but then a curious thing happened. They bonded over lunch at Bird's. Johnson was invited over. His mom greeted him with a big hello and a hug, and he said, well, she got me right then and there. And then he and Larry sat down for lunch, and they learned that they were very much alike. Both were from the Midwest. They grew up poor. Family was everything to them. Basketball was everything to them. And that changed Johnson's outlook on Larry Bird. And there were people who couldn't believe that the two had had lunch together. But do you see what happens here? What happens around the table doesn't happen anywhere else. Jesus' life begins and ends at the table. He was born in a stable. He was placed in a feed trough, a place, a table from which animals would eat. At the end of his life, just before he goes to be crucified, he gathered his disciples with him for the Last Supper. In the upper room, they reclined around a table. They shared a meal together, and it was then that Jesus took bread and broke it and lifted the cup. After that, after his resurrection, how does he show himself? When 2 of his followers were walking back from Jerusalem to Emmaus, he had just been crucified. They were talking about this. They were all upset. So they're walking along, and then a stranger joins them. And after some conversation again about Jesus and everything that had happened, it was getting late. The stranger was ready to go on alone, but then men said, no, just come on back to our house and stay at our place. And he did, and they sat at a table, and they ate together. And just before eating, this stranger asked God's blessing on the food, took a small loaf of bread and broke it and passed it to them. When suddenly it was as though the eyes were opened, because these men then suddenly recognized him, recognized this stranger in their midst. It was Jesus. Again, what happens around the table doesn't happen anywhere else. What I'm hoping this does is just tell us and encourage us all to bring back the table. A place where good things happen. A place where we see, hear, and know our identity, who we are, where we belong, how we fit into the world today. I hope we'll bring back the table, a place where our story is shared, where we make it our own, and know our identity and be proud of it. In this story, have you ever asked what God's first words were? And have you ever asked what God's last words were? Genesis 2, it says, God says, you may eat freely from every tree of the garden. Now, many think God said, don't do this, don't do that. That's kind of the way people are raised, that's the form of Christian. We have a lot of rules and regulations, but that's not how God started. But in the second verse, he does, the following verse in 2:17, he does say, do not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But the first, remember his first words. Eat freely. His last words, Revelation, the last book, last chapter, is where Jesus says, let the one who is thirsty come, the one who desires the water of life, drink freely. First words, eat freely. Last words, drink freely. So first and last words, everything in between is a table. I say it's like a table because in between there are things to be taken. And what's served on this table is not a snack, it's not fast food, and it's not a smorgasbord where you take what you like and leave what you don't like. It's a life course meal on which is served the bread of life and the cup of salvation, Jesus Christ. Let's bring back the table. Let's keep our story alive in our hearts and in the hearts of everyone else we love. In Revelations 3:20, remember I read this before, it said, here I am, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person and they with me. Yes, I read it at the beginning. I'm reading it again now because here we have a wonderful description of what's waiting for us in eternity. Not a Bible study, not a prayer meeting, but a table, a banquet table. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, Jesus says, I'll come in and I'll eat with this person. A table. I call it a banquet table. And Jesus wants our company at that table forever. What better image could there be than that? Let's pray. Lord God, we ask that you help us bring back the table, help us come to the table, help us bring to the table hearts that have the sincere desire to know our story, to own it, and to live it out each and every day. We are your children. We are loved by you. And we want you to be in our hearts and at work in our lives each and every day. So help us know and help us remember always that our identity is in you. You give us purpose and you give us gifts to live life fully and well. So taking that story within, we just ask it too that you help us share it with others, with our family and with our friends. And may we be forever faithful to you, firmly grounded in our relationship with you. And as we prepare our hearts now to come today to the table, the communion table, the place where your story is forever remembered, may your Spirit renew our hearts, refresh our minds, and just reassure us again of the truth and of the love that we have to share with others. We prepare now to come to your table. Amen.